So when you've been a dean, the three most important words are please keep eating. I want to thank Donald and Betsy and Dean White and Diane and Charlie and Laura and Tim, the Rust Center, for inviting me to the other Athens and the other Georgia. Yesterday, actually, I was in New York, and I was supposed to go to DC, and then I was going to come down this morning, and then because of the weather, I quite literally found myself leaving on a midnight plane to Georgia. I mean, really, it was one of these things. Do you want to get on at midnight? And I said, you know, I'd rather live in their world than live without them in mine. Now, my last 30 plus years I've spent as an international law professor. I should say that this PowerPoint is going to be Xeroxed and given out tomorrow, so please don't disrupt your eating by writing anything down. I also very much am interested in your questions because I have a feeling that you might have some. And so I think my 30 years have been divided into 30 years as a professor, 20 as a human rights lawyer, now 10 full years in the US government and 5 as a dean. And in each role I've asked myself, what is useful international legal scholarship? And to be honest, that is one of the issues to which I plan to devote the time I have left in active academic life. For the frank reason that I think that things have taken a bit of a wrong turn, and I think it ought to be put back, and I think I'm positioned in a way that I can say that. So I actually asked if I could come here to give this talk, also being aware that some will view it as either self-loathing or loathing of academia or presumptuous or whatever. All I can say is that what I'm about to say is true and reflects things I also said on a panel, a very useful panel that was set up in January, in which I think everybody who spoke is here, Betsy, Lori McCow, Diane, Kurt Bradley, and myself. Now, my last 4 years, I've been legal advisor of the State Department. It's been tremendously exciting. Here's some pictures just to kind of give you something to look at while you're chewing away. The Human Rights Council in Geneva. I was in Moscow on the right, in Iraq on the left, bottom left, Guantanamo on the bottom right. In fact, I've been to Guantanamo. My wife figured out I've been working on Guantanamo for 18 of my last 21 birthdays, which is a sad statement in and of itself. I made many trips, the one on the left, Afghanistan, the one in the middle, to Athens during the economic crisis, on the right with Madeleine Albright and others to Korea for the funeral of President Kim Dae-jung. I've appeared in many courts at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, both on ICJ cases and arbitration cases, the European Court of Human Rights in the middle, the African Court of Human and People's Rights, and down to the bottom right, I've been our co-head of delegation to the International Criminal Court. And I've taken many flights. This one became unexpectedly famous because we flew into Libya. That's Jeff Feltman on the right, who was then Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs. We were in Malta on a military transport, and everybody else was sitting along the wall, but they had 4 business class seats, so I sat behind the secretary and she started texting away and everyone took these pictures. I actually at one point texted to her, look over your right shoulder, which she did, and my kids told me I should have said, "Was up," so I now know what that means. Now, with regard to international legal scholarship, I think the glass is half empty and the glass is half full. And I'm going to start with the half empty part because I think that international legal scholarship can be so much more than it is. But I want to conclude on the upward note why it's half full, and then suggest some concrete steps that academia, policymakers, and also this society can take to address the issue. Now, this is, as you know, from the famous Law Review article by Fred Rodell, What's Wrong with Legal Scholarship? Its Form and Its Content. I think the same is true with international legal scholarship, which I think at the moment is in a very sad state. What's wrong with the form? Most of the articles are too long, they're overly complex, they're user-unfriendly, they're Americano-centric, they are inside baseball in the sense that they're directed to a very narrow group of people, jargon-driven to speak to those people. There are too many footnotes, and virtually all of the titles are long and confusing. But that's just the form. What about the content? They're under-edited. They lack any clear thesis or line of argument. A good article should simply say, here's a problem, here's my thesis, here's how my thesis solves the problem. And virtually no article I read these days does that. Moreover, it is amazing how many articles fail the most basic test. Why should I care? What is the problem that you are addressing? And why should we care about that problem? I regularly read articles where after about 5 pages, they're writing about something, but they haven't made me care. And then the answer to the problem that's given is also unclear. And so the net result of the article is to give a non-answer to a non-question in 125 pages. But that's only part of the problem. Most articles I read these days are unconnected to the practice of international law, and therefore policy irrelevant, which is useless to solving problems for which policymakers are actively seeking answers. And I think this is bad, because I am a policymaker, and I have spent my life reading legal scholarship. I very frequently, when I tackle an issue, look for relevant legal scholarship, and I'll be honest, I almost never find any. Sometimes I find something where there are a couple footnotes that are relevant, or a page or two of history, and I send my special assistants out to look, and I'm appalled. It was less so when I was Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, but even then, the pattern was beginning. But now it's out of control. So who's to blame? Everyone. And let me just go through this. I blame first law schools, and I was a law dean. The incentive structures are now totally twisted. The students have been brought into international specialty journals, where often the school celebrates the regular law journal over the international journal. Then they go to the job of getting a job, which didn't used to exist. It's a new academic rank. How do you get onto tenure track? This is something that's been created by competition among schools over the last 5 to 10 years, and I think it's ridiculous. In the old days, if you were a talented young person who had clerked, you became an assistant professor. Now you have to go to a place where you're a fellow or a VAP or whatever, simply to have the credentials to go to the ALS meeting. I will do everything I can to stop this. I think it's damaging. I think it hurts young professors. I think it hurts two-career families. I've watched a number of colleagues of mine and students of mine go through this process. I think it's unbearable. It is simply designed to prevent appointments committees from making a decision as to whether or not to bet on a young person. And it creates a place where they can be held for a couple of years so you don't have to make that decision. Because everybody wants a sure thing, And there is no such thing as a sure thing. You have to bet. And it's partly because faculty appointments committees have gotten in the business of being entirely risk averse that this whole tier of academic life has been created. Once you get on tenure track, you're subject to a tenure vote by the faculty, most of whom know nothing about international law. And the pressure has now shifted to the lateral market, where professors get tenure and then want to change schools, which places a premium on their being influential. It reduces their loyalty to a school, and very frequently, faculty members move at a very high cost to the school and themselves at various stages of their career. And frankly, just like in baseball, it turns out they would have been the best if they just stayed where they started. Editors know little or nothing because most of the journals are peer-reviewed. Because blogs now have taken on much of the role of explanation that used to be in law review articles like case comments, law reviews are now being held for high theory. High theory has to be done in hundreds of pages. And so everyone's trying to hit a home run, or they can't get their article published, when in fact it's not that easy on your first article to hit a home run. And what all of it has done is to make someone who's operating within this perverse system's best move to distance themselves from the very phenomenon that they want to write about, which is international law and how it works in the real world. I told you I was going to be frank, but this is how I see it. This has had a deleterious effect of privileging non-legal work over legal work. International law and lawyering have been devalued. The kinds of work that used to be valued, like restatements or practitioner-focused work, is much less, counts much less in a tenure packet. It's very hard to do practice, except if you're in a clinic, at which point you face other kinds of issues with regard to relative status within the law school. And here is what I think is the greatest harm of all. It used to be that a serious practitioner could nevertheless teach and then eventually go into practice, but the barrier to entry is now so high that if you have a serious practice, you have no time to write, research, or even interview for a job. And by a certain age, you are out of the junior market and you're into the adjunct market. The gauntlet for junior professors is too taxing, which has skewed, because of the interest in publication, making it easier to have a PhD than a serious practice experience in international law, which is one reason why PhDs in other disciplines are tending to get better jobs than people who have practiced international law for a comparable period of time at a very high level. What are the consequences? Faculties are dominated by those who have not practiced international law. Since they don't know anything about international law, they have an incentive to say the practice doesn't matter, which is a self-perpetuating cycle. Young scholars can't get their practical experience before tenure track, before tenure. Afterwards, it's like the internship system in medicine. They have an incentive to stay with it. It's hard to get public service leaves. Those are very strictly time limited, give very minimal exposure to those who actually want to experience practice. And it leaves this tragic consequence. Most professors of international law don't know how international law actually influences decision-making or outcomes. I talked to hundreds of international lawyers, I talked to hundreds of international law professors, and I'm struck by how much international law professors generally live in a world which is not the world of what international lawyers do. And as they say, when you can't measure what's important, you make important that which you can measure, and that's the scholarship that these professors tend to do. Now, why do I mention this? Look at these folks: Louis Sohn, Eugene Rostow, Abram Shays, Dean Rusk, Lou Henkin, Roz Higgins, Oscar Schachter, Nicholas Katzenbach. I could add to that David Biederman. They all practiced at a very high level for an extended period of time. And the bitter truth is too few leading scholars to these days actually have practiced at that level. And I mean spending serious time in the government, not a year, not a semester, but multiple years or a decade in a genuine decision-making position as opposed to an advisory position. You know, Lou Henkin was the ambassador of the United States to the Conference on Stateless Persons. You know, Ted Moran was legal advisor of the Israeli government. Abram Chase was legal advisor for 3 years. Nicholas Katzenbach was Deputy Secretary of State and Attorney General. Dean Rusk was Secretary of State before he went to teaching. Louis Sohn ran the Law of the Sea Convention. We do not have that anymore. And it's nobody's fault except for the fact that if you really want that experience, you have to give up your academic post and aspirations. And why does it matter? Because I think that to talk about this international lawyering without practicing is like talking about judging without having been a clerk. Because the influence of law is extremely hard to measure. But every political decision is actually made in the shadow of the law. So the more time you spend in rooms where the law enters the decision, the more you start to understand why law matters or when it matters. And this becomes particularly true at a time like now, when new technologies are coming in, but the laws are rarely changing, and international lawyers have to understand which pieces of old laws they are willing to keep hold of and which parts they're willing to say no longer apply. You need to have the big picture more and more, I find, not just understand particular issues, and you need to understand what the role of the lawyers is. Academics tend to be their own client, and they need to understand how lawyers can expand policy options. Because if there's a great challenge for what lawyers do, it's how to expand the policy option set beyond what you're presented with. And most of all, I think that practice matters because it gives you a sense of interconnectedness between issues and the relative proportion that law plays in any particular situation. If you haven't practiced, you do not have that feel. I didn't have that feel. And I was considered on the high end of this before I did this, and I'm struck by how little of a feel I actually had. So I take this famous case, Abe Shays, Dean Rusk, Cuban Missile Crisis, weapons are in Cuba, Soviet weapons are in Cuba, 3 terrible options: do nothing, invade by ground a couple weeks after the Bay of Pigs, or do a unilateral aerial strike, what Bobby Kennedy called in 30 days, I don't want my brother to be another Tojo. It was the combination of the policymakers and the lawyers who came up with the 4th option, which started as blockade, which looked like an act of war, and then shifted into the phrase quarantine, combined with an OAS resolution, which, as you know, was the option that they chose. So what the lawyers did was they went to and created a 4th option that wasn't in the original set, pushed it forward and made it lawful. Why do I mention that? Because quite recently I went through a similar exercise. Libya, we had begun a multilateral action, and we were faced with the possibility of genuine slaughter of civilians in Benghazi, and there were 3 unacceptable options: do nothing and risk their slaughter. In fact, it was nearly certain. Hope that Congress would enact legislation when they had made it clear that they would not, when they all said that the War Powers Resolution didn't apply, or assert the unconstitutionality of the War Powers Resolution, which would have turned this moment into a constitutional crisis. So what we did, and I'll be honest, I led the argument for this. We accepted the constitutionality of the resolution. We fit the Libyan case within the existing understanding of the word hostilities, and we said that this was not the kind of hostilities that the War Powers Resolution had contemplated. We did not challenge the constitutionality of the War Powers Resolution, and quite frankly, we said the War Powers Resolution was intended to be a no more Vietnam statute. It was not intended to be a let's have many more Rwanda statute. And we essentially put it into a fact-specific frame that when U.S. armed forces are part of a supportive multilateral role limited to protecting civilians with tremendously low levels of violence. The violence in Libya was 1% of what we dropped in Kosovo. No U.S. casualties, no U.S. ground troops, zero risk of escalation. And on the list of cases that had not constituted hostilities, it came in about number 7 in terms of past examples. We said it was a reasonable argument under the circumstances, a legally available alternative to say it wasn't hostilities. Now, we got tremendous criticism for this until it succeeded. And since then, we've heard relatively little. I got many letters and emails apologizing privately, but never saying publicly that they actually thought that the position ought to be different. Now, I don't want to claim that government lawyers are great, but you have to understand the differences. I've mentioned roles, you're not your own client. Academics tend to be individuals. Lawyers work in teams. Academics tend to favor equality and freedom, where lawyers tend to work in hierarchies. Academics tend to specialize in originality, where lawyers have to work within the tradition and the precedent. Academics like to say more. Government lawyers like to say less. Academics love having opinions, but for the government lawyers, the key thing is achieving results. And most of all, academics love to know about theory, where government lawyers care the most about facts. So here are some misunderstandings. And these are all cases where in my time in the government, I've been stunned by the academic response, which has given me a very strong feeling that academics, and I'm not talking about every academic, but many academics have lost a feel for how international law really works. So take Libya R2P. Whether or not you agree with the approach the Obama administration took, if you favor R2P at an international level, you must have a theory of the War Powers Resolution that kicks in 60 to 90 days later. And if you don't actually have an approach that makes any sense. And many, many people called for Libyan action and then had no idea at the 60 to 90 day point as to what war powers were supposed to do. And what our theory was essentially a theory of how you could do R2P multilaterally in a way that wasn't hostilities, was different from Vietnam, didn't challenge the constitutionality of the statute, and didn't trigger a 90-day pullout at a time when Congress clearly was not going to do anything. Or take the second example, which is the one I asked to Patricia today. Lawyers tend to favor the concept of R2P, but they don't have a sense of the follow-on responsibility if you do R2P. Who will succeed the outsiders who intervene? Will it be a UN protectorate? Will it be a Syrian opposition? Does anybody here know how many splinter groups there are in Syria? Give me a number. How many splinter groups are there fighting in Syria?
200.
At least 295. And will they form a coalition government? Or let's take another example of interconnectedness, counterterrorism. And again, this is where the case-specific, country-specific focus of international lawyers misses the interconnectedness. What we have seen in the last few years is the decay of Afghanistan, triggered largely by a mistaken decision to invade Iraq, the Afghanistanization of Yemen, and now the Yemenization of Mali, triggered by the Arab awakening, which has unleashed huge amounts of weapons to be available to the Tuaregs, which now makes possible extraordinary instability in Africa. And I never read any academic accounts that understand this geographic interconnectedness. Or take another example of interconnectedness, the Arctic. Global warming melts the ice cap. Global warming triggered by fossil fuels. If you believe in fossil fuels playing a role in global warming, it makes it possible to go deeper into the Arctic. It makes it possible to drill deeper. It makes it possible to assert claims over the outer continental shelf, which then makes it possible, if you want, to extract more fossil fuels. And the question is, should that be done? Is that part of the strategy here or not? I just gave a speech a couple days ago that's reported in Opinio Juris today about 21st century international lawmaking. Colleagues like Ona Hathaway, others write about the tripartite framework, treaties, congressional executive agreements, sole executive agreements. And when the Anti-Counterfeiting and Trade Act came up, a whole bunch of professors, mostly intellectual property professors, signed a letter where they essentially said, this doesn't look like a treaty, it doesn't look like a congressional executive agreement, it doesn't look like a sole executive agreement, and therefore there must be no authority for this agreement. As if our lawmaking authorities fall on separate stools and somehow this just fell between the stools as opposed to lying on a continuum authority like the Algiers Accords did in Dames and Moore versus Reagan. And the speech I gave, which I'd ask you to take a look at because it lays it out more clearly, points out the differences between how academics approach the subject of international cooperation and how practitioners do. Or take another example. The number of times I'm asked, the United States has not changed its position toward the ICC. Why? Because we haven't ratified the Rome Treaty in the Obama administration. When in fact, we've shifted from a policy of outright hostility to one of positive engagement, recognizing that the US executive branch tends to adopt a policy of compliance before ratification, where many other countries adopt a policy of ratification before compliance. So is it a disgrace that we haven't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child and every other country has? Yes. Is the United States' performance with respect to the obligations of the Convention on the Rights of the Child superior than all but about 10 countries that are parties? Yes. Or how about customary international law? You know, customary international law turns on state practice, which means you have to know what state practice is. But increasingly, customary international law is being written by NGOs. Take the Direct Participation in Hostilities report, or the Tallinn Manual. Or finally, bin Laden. The number of folks who I think just did not understand the self-defense argument against bin Laden, they focused on whether bin Laden was himself holding a gun, when everybody knew the real issue was, did he have a cell phone? Because if he had been alive, he could have called in an attack of the kind he's done dozens before. And the self-defense issue was not a personal self-defense issue for the Navy soldiers who went in. It was a national self-defense measure that as long as he's giving orders, he can trigger any number of preordained attacks. You don't have to agree with any of these things to see that what I'm trying to argue is that there's a kind of bigger picture that tends to get lost if you focus in on a single concept or issue. And that this is what the picture is about. I'm finding increasingly in the scholarship that I read, the academics simply cannot tell the difference between the donut and the hole. More than that, they lose a sense of proportion. The issue that they focus on is the thing that they can count. Although Einstein said not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. Now here's another thing. A little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. I actually find that people who have spent a little bit of time in the government are more likely to pronounce, which is even worse. It's like the literature that you see by law clerks about life on the court, which someone once called to me the World Series as seen from the perspective of the bat boy. You know, a law clerk who clerked in a particular term will make the cases of that term more important than they were. When I did Justice Blackmun's oral history, I was stunned that even though he had had battles with different justices over the course of the year that I clerked for him, by the time he had retired, he had completely come to peace with those people because he had dealt with them on thousands and thousands of other cases. Or let me take another example, network theory. At one point, a political scientist, quite well-known one, said to me, private actors, NGO actors are key. Take the case of the Basel Ministerial. To which I said, the Basel Ministerial involves ministers. It's not an NGO activity. It's activity among foreign ministers or finance ministers. It's not an NGO network at all. How can that possibly be your example? And this person, who was extremely distinguished, had no idea what a ministerial was. Another leading scholar, in a paper that I read, described American unilateralism toward North Korea, and when I asked this person about the six-party talks, had no idea what the six-party talks were. Although the policy recommendation of the paper was threatening nuclear attack against North Korea, which to me is extraordinarily irresponsible. That you can have a theory, which as a matter of game theory calls for a nuclear attack, that some people might actually take seriously, and you don't actually understand the framework of engagement with that country has been a multilateral framework through the six-party talks all along. Or take another example, a basic lack of understanding of how the decision-making system and its component parts work, what the comparative advantage of each part is. I think many, many people literally do not understand the chain of command. At one point, I was in a meeting where an academic said to me, why can't somebody in the White House call somebody in the Pentagon and tell them to stop, citing the commander-in-chief power, when of course the chains of command run from the president to the Secretary of Defense through the joint commands, et cetera, and is not exercised by low-level officials at their whim. Or take another example where I think it's had a profound influence. Those who say Obama's policies and Bush's policies on use of force are essentially the same. They're not. Here are 5 ways in which the Obama policy has been put into a different lawful frame. Here are 6 important principles that we have applied that were not applied. We don't call it a global war on terror. We follow a domestic legislative authority, not inherent constitutional authority. We explicitly follow international law. We combine a law enforcement and law of war paradigm. We use a fact-based, not label-based scenario, and under no circumstances is there a humane treatment. Now, this requires understanding of nuance, and it's very important, I think, that we have it. And how about blogs? Don't worry, I'm getting to the end of my critical part here. Blogs are a double-edged sword. It has, in many respects, fostered soundbite scholarship. It's more important to have a strong and distinctive position than to get it right. It's much easier to score points and just deconstruct positions and ask, what should we do instead? And at the end of the day, blogs is just more chatter. One baseball manager put it well. Over there, they get paid for saying stuff. Over here, we get paid for doing stuff. So, the glass is half empty. And I think that the first thing I would urge academia to do is to acknowledge, maybe you don't think it's half empty, but at least acknowledge that there's a problem. But I don't want to end this lecture on a down note. So why is the glass half full? First of all, here's the upside of blogs. As, say, It Law Girls, new voices have been brought into the mix. Just as the civil rights movement brought law and practice closer together, the so-called war on terror has generated a new generation of scholars who are relevant to a national security debate. Bloggers help the public become better acquainted with complex legal issues. The quality of media coverage has been far superior. Issues can be raised at less than law review length. But the complication is that appointments committees still don't know how to evaluate the worth of blogs. And in many blogs, there's little or no quality control. Another reason the glass is half full is the world has changed very substantially. We're no longer in a Cold War. Certain kinds of disciplines, for example, I think game theory, are much less applicable than they were in a bipolar world, in a flat world of myriad transnational actors. And another reason that the glass is half full is we have a much richer brew than we did 25 years ago. There's many different types of work: interdisciplinary, empirical, transcontinental, transnational, advocacy scholarship, critical scholarship, and process scholarship, which some of us like to call the New Haven School. And then some common questions like the compliance question cut across schools. Schools of thought here, of course, is, I had to in Athens show The School of Athens by Raphael. Of course, the great thing about this painting is it captures two schools: the Athens Philosophical School and the Renaissance School of Painting, of which Michelangelo and Raphael were a part. And each school of scholarship has the virtue of its vices. So interdisciplinary work has greatly enriched examination, but on the other hand, it's tended to devalue law. Empirical work has privilege which you can count and not what you can't count. Advocacy work tends to lack balance or nuance. Critical work is better at deconstructing the status quo than generating better alternatives. Process scholarship suffers from selection effects, and all of them suffer from an academic disease, which is acting like your theory is the only one that makes sense or has a monopoly on wisdom, when in fact, as the blind men in the elephant show, that's what the picture is, everybody could be right and collectively describing the entire elephant. And I think we are now in an age of interdisciplinary work. The academy combines theory and practice. The legal curriculum blends the public and private. The curriculum focuses on transnational law and law globalization. And many in the legal academy, including myself, see ourselves as having normative commitments to human rights and the rule of law, the kind that Patricia mentioned at lunch. So, here's just my view. To be useful, I think international legal scholarship should make 5 commitments: to theory and interdisciplinary work, to transnationalism, to process, to normativity, and to practice, public service, and policy relevance. And let me say a word about each. That there are so many different disciplines that are now relevant to legal scholarship. They should all be incorporated so long as none claims a monopoly in wisdom. I've said, and people understand, my own scholarship is about transnational law, transnational legal process, and substance. This was the matrix that we in the 20th century studied. So you had domestic public law, constitutional law, criminal law, domestic private law, torts, contracts, property, public international law, treaties, use of force, private international law, IBT. The matrix is a construct. It should be rejected. Now, increasingly, most law is transnational law. Here are some of the courses that are studied that actually destroyed this matrix between public, private, domestic, and international. And I find increasingly that this gives more realistic weight to the role of other actors in the process besides states, deepens the internalization, places greater emphasis on values as making us stronger and safer. Commitment to process is a particular interest of mine. In the New Haven School, I've identified here a number of scholars who I think are in that school and some of the work that they've done. A commitment to normativity means that positive theory should be viewed in light of norms, and the interplay between law and policy requires the dynamic, normative, and constructive goal of scholarship. And then finally, in the area of law and policy, law and practice, I think that practice theory should not be studied in isolation from practice, and scholarly work should connect with policy through public commentary, activist work, clinical work, work by professors in the same way as occurred during the civil rights movement. Let me close with some prescriptions, and I intend to work on these going forward. For academia, I think tenure standards should reflect other kinds of work than the kind of work that is now celebrated to the exclusion of others. I think that appointment and promotion decisions should give way to the real-world impact of what someone does. I think that younger scholars should have more of an opportunity to gain practice and policy experience. If one summer they go and work somewhere, as opposed to writing an article, it's not clear to me that that's not a better use of their time or a greater contribution. You should require academic faculty to demonstrate clinical competence. My office, the Office of the Legal Advisor of the State Department, as a group of 20 to 30 lawyers every year, twice a year, goes down to the DC Bar Pro Bono Project, and we represent pro bono clients who walk in the door. And I represent, people who are doing consumer bankruptcies or getting evicted from their house or trying to set up a constructive trust. I was brought into this by my wife, who's a legal services attorney. And it's pretty hilarious. We go in there and they say, what's your area of expertise? ICJ litigation or diplomatic immunity or drone technology and use of force. To be honest, I had been the legal advisor of the State Department, a chaired professor for 20 years, and I wasn't sure if I could represent a consumer bankruptcy. Fortunately, my wife was there and she had done it, so we did it together. I think we need to encourage universities to value real-time contributions and more academic time in policy think tanks. So, for example, most academics are not close to the Army War College or the Naval War College or various policy shops, but spending more time there would force them to make their legal analysis more relevant to what policymakers do. But I think that policymakers should change as well. I think that policymakers should engage more in research. At Yale, we had a globalization seminar for a while where 20 professors from Yale met every time a famous international person came to town. And we had the so-called academic dialogue. Then a leading person like Richard Holbrooke or Madeleine Albright or Kofi Annan would come in and give a speech, but then the next morning we would meet them for breakfast and realize how little we knew about the facts and how little they knew about our theories, and then try to have a dialogue with them in that setting. I think we need many more professors of practice. It's very unusual for a Dean Rusk to teach at an American law school these days. We need more sabbaticals so policymakers can go and teach in law schools to prevent their burnout. I think we need more membership and engagement with learned society, something I've been discussing with Donald, which might be as simple as whether or not government lawyers have to pay admissions fees. We need more interconnectedness between policymakers and the academy, and that's something as legal advisor I've tried to do with various advisory committees, bringing in professors for one-day fellowships, having our lawyers guest teach in other classes. And then one of our innovations at L, the Counselor of International Law, a position held by a number of the folks here. What people don't know is that those counselors of international law are paid for by their law schools to practice in our office for a year. And I think more deans should make that payment. Because frankly, if you have a professor of international law who doesn't have that kind of experience, they're only giving their students part of what international law is really about. And finally, some prescriptions for groups like the ASIL and the American Association of Law Schools. I think more engagement with foreign societies of international law, more peer review procedures. I saw that Jose is instilling this at the NYU JILP. More policy commentators on scholarly blogs. I think Opinio Juris is doing more of that. More support groups for younger scholars of the kind that's going on here. More roundtables between practitioner and scholarly groups. I know that this is happening under Betsy's watch. And more focus on genuinely global issues involving deterritorialization. I end at this point for a very simple reason. Here are some issues that are already upon us. Cyberspace, the Arctic, geopolitical environment, genetically modified organisms, assisted reproductive technologies. And I'm just not seeing enough scholarship on this. Most of the scholarship I read could have been written in the 1950s. These practices have deterritorialized our world. Who's the person who's writing about the human rights of clones? I'm going to do that, because I think there are going to be clones. There are going to be a lot of clones out there. And the question is, or persons who are born through various assisted reproductive technologies, and the question is, are they or are they not considered fully human? And are they or are they not going to be treated by our human rights system as entitled to the same set of rights as anyone else who's born of a human mother, like Macbeth? So that's my suggestions for all of you. I think there's useful scholarship to be done. I think the frank assessment is that much of the way that the system of academia has evolved to this date is something that ought to be looked at very closely, and that we together might want to make a collective effort to try to address it. I think the glass is half full, but it's also half empty, and I think there are particular prescriptions that we can all pursue. But let me just give you this one example. Privacy before the Supreme Court in the last case involving GPS was addressed by our Supreme Court justices with a test of whether a physical search had gone on or whether there was a physical trespass to place a GPS system onto a car. The Supreme Court in the 21st century adopted a physical trespass test at a time when every American carries a GPS on their own body, which they put there themselves. And the real question is not that's not the privacy question. The privacy question is, at what point can you actually use wireless technology to tap into the GPS that somebody's put on themselves and pick up their signals, which is what they are doing in China every single day. I know because I was in China and they were doing it to me. I think that what's happening is that our courts are simply not prepared for the 21st century, and they won't be. So it has to be up to the academics and the learned societies to see that they are. In a deterritorialized world, we are dealing with these concepts through territorial concepts. which were outmoded when they're developed, and they're really outmoded now. So we have a big challenge ahead of us. I think it's great to have these dialogues and discussions, but I hope with this, admittedly, critical presentation, I'm trying to spark more self-reflection, challenges to what I have to say, and other approaches that people might come up. Because as I say, the American Society of International Law and its members will be critical on these issues going forward. Thank you.